Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Gus Crane. I'm a member of the Student Lecture Series Committee here at the Cooper Union's Erwin S. Chanin School of Architecture. Tonight, we're extremely excited to be joined by Charlotte Malterre-Barthes. Charlotte Malterre-Barthes is Assistant Professor of Urban Design at Harvard GSD. As an architect, urban designer, and scholar, Malterre-Barthes' interests are related to urgent aspects of contemporary urbanization, material extraction, the climate emergency, and how struggling communities can gain greater access to resources, the mainstream economy, better governance, and ecological and social justice. While directing the MAS Urban Design at the Chair of Marc Angélil, Malterre-Barthes has earned her doctoral degree from the Swiss Federal Institute of Technology in Zurich on the political economy of commodities and the built environment. She co-authored award-winning books such as Migrant Marseille, Architects of Social Segregation, and the Urban Inclusivity, Some Haunted Spaces in Singapore, and Housing Cairo, the Informal Response, among others. Malterre-Barthes is a founding member of the Parity Group and the Parity Front activist networks dedicated to improving gender equality and diversity in architecture. So as always, I'd like to thank Elise Jaff and Jeffrey Brown for their continued support of the Student Lecture Series. And without further ado, we're really excited to see you, to hear you talk. And if you're ready, you can go ahead and share.
Thanks, Gus, for the introduction, and also thank everyone for the invitation to this exciting lecture series. It's really wonderful to be able to talk about my work. So I'm going to do the ubiquitous and share screen. So please, Gus, let me know you should see the screen with my info, correct?
Yeah, it looks good.
Okay, and here's the title. So on top of what has already been said, I would like to add a few words about me. So I define myself as an architect, an urban designer, and an activist, as well as an educator. And those are facets of my work that are very much interrelated and propelled by a sense of urgency in regard to the state of our world. So I define my work as the critical practice of urban design, something that maybe can be akin to spatial practices, I guess, which is a term that you might have heard before. So I actually merge practice, research, and teaching interests. And I try to explore new ways to understand the conditions of the built environment, as well as new formats to communicate these findings and to discuss also design solutions. And I would like to bring forth this articulated under Manoeuvring boundaries as a proposed title. Apparently there are different spellings to that term, so we'll be also maneuvering orthography, possibly. So with Manoeuvring boundaries, I wanted to also articulate a critique of architecture and planning as disciplines that claim innocence, an innocence that I would like to challenge because of the role that capital accumulation and the corresponding destructive processes at work in the transfer of raw materials to the built environment, but also our professional partake in the design of injustice, so injustice by design and oppression, down to the exploitative ways that the profession itself operates within, so exhaustion and unpaid labor. So I also speak for an urgency to reform design from conceptual processes to the office. And with my work, I hope to address the role of design in the production of space, to question the role of designers within market-driven logics, and I attempt to equip young professionals with the tools to resist against the mechanisms of brutal urbanization that have led to untenable situations of spatial and social injustice everywhere. So I hope to articulate a framework for a climate-aware, ethical, social, political practice of urban design toward responsible planning approaches, both preemptive and reactive of contemporary situations. I do that, as you see, with different means, and I hope to show you some of those now. For the purpose of this talk, I will discuss 3 themes to articulate what these maneuvering boundaries could look like when applied, as we advocate for spatial practices from architecture to urban design that can respond to challenges of our uncertain future. So with the topic of resources and how to engage with resources consumption in general, I would talk about food, but also land, water, through the lens of self-built urbanization in Cairo. Then I will be looking at governance and trying to address migration and public housing, building maintenance, and how the practice of urban design can be propositional and offer new responses to counter the economic forces that generate increased poverty, while articulating a hopefully constructive critique of bad governance in Marseille, which is also my hometown. And then with the topic of ecology, and by extension materials, seeking to bridge this distance between design to material extraction, production and consumption. I'm trying to identify construction commodities chains and their relation to the built environment to unearth hidden realities that are considered largely to be beyond the purview of architecture and design disciplines, and with a call for action. And as we go by, you shall see that the methods of operating move from research to drawing to design to publication, shows, movies, graphic novels, collages, and various forms of activism. There to perhaps maneuvering boundaries around what it means to be an architect and an urban designer. So many of the themes and the topics, so my research is on resources and on economy and governance, are grounded in my dissertation, which is entitled Food Territories, the Political Economy of Food Systems and its Effects on the Built Environment, case study Egypt, which is in publication process. It's a work that aims to identify how commodities, and in that particular case, we're looking at wheat grain, affect the built environment from an architectural, urban, and territorial point of view, and to highlight the mechanisms that are producing and shaping space. So this is to say that this understanding of space grounded in the political economy is a formative one that has shaped a lot of my further research, pedagogy, and strategic practice. So to recognize complex contingency between food, governance, and space in the context of Egypt, one of the key segments pertaining to spatial impacts of the political economy of food is in fact food production, urbanization, and agrarian land, the kind of equation that I discussed with the case of Cairo, looking at the competition for land use between agriculture and urbanization, with one of the main feature of Egypt geography being that kind of scarcity of agrarian land, what you see gray on the map, which are defined as the old lands, and we will see why. The mode of spatial production at work here is the transformation of these fertile old lands of Egypt into self-urbanized areas. This competition between two of the most basic human needs, food and shelter, and looking at this precarious imbalance between urban growth and agricultural land somehow epitomizes these tensions between urban dynamics, environmental concerns with regard to local food supply, and sustainable urbanism. What you see here is an illegal construction that is being incrementally built over agrarian land. It is representative of the physical fabric that is generated by self-built housing production. Here on this cadastral-based map, you can see on the east side, the traditional city of Cairo. This is the area of Mohandisin around 1970, which is when the time that the drawing represents. And you can see that the urbanization is already creeping at the limits of the city on agrarian land, which are the longitudinal fields that you can see, which are called fedans. And this is the area today. So despite its importance for local food security, we can see that arable land is disappearing under this kind of destructive forces of urbanization. And this is a restructuration of territory that emerged in this new urban form that somehow mirrors the property limits of the field. And to explain that process of growth, what you can see on the upper part of the screens are these fedans, which are very long fields that are subdivided in smaller units that you can see that are almost like squares based on agrarian practices, then the owners would sell pieces of the land and some construction appear. The canals, which are previously used for irrigation, are filled to create access roads. Then the buildings multiply and they start to affect the agrarian practices. The land prices go up and agriculture become less profitable. Finally, the tenants are evicted and the regime policies has accelerated this with, for instance, Hosni Mubarak canceling any kind of tenant protection for farmers who are just farming the land and not owning it. And finally, the entire field or fedan is constructed and the area is urbanized. And the typical architecture that is generated by these processes is built on small plots of this kirat that I mentioned, 12 by 14 meter, blind on 3 facades with a full occupancy of plots, except for like 2.5, which you see the kind of cantilevering for the streets. It's always a concrete structure and a brick infill. And there is a central staircase with 3 ventilation shafts. So it's a typology that is repeated with very few variations all over agrarian land. And it's important to signal that this unit is not to be understood as a single architectural entity, but is in fact the very fabric of the city because it's an endlessly repeated type. So the typical small scale building, what you see on the left side, which is incrementally built, say 1 floor per year, is now complemented by what you see on the right side, which is a one-off 15-story tower, a more speculative mode of construction that has emerged recently. But both buildings basically tell this tale of the destruction of local agriculture by self-organizing or semi-formal groups who are building much needed affordable housing, albeit illegally. And the repetition of these types creates along the field a kind of longitudinal street type, what you see here, which is a kind of urban canyon. And this is actually the reality for some 12 million inhabitants. We're talking about 60% of Cairo. So the majority, in fact, live in areas of this type. And it's a self-built urbanism that is not without problems, as these neighborhoods are completely underserviced and ignored by the authorities most of the time, perhaps except when elections are coming up. So in fact, this is important because the food riots that were the demonstration that challenged the Egyptian regime in 2011, what has come to be known as the Arab Spring, originated a few streets away. So in a way, linking this kind of food riots and urban discontent to this type of spatial production. So these are political, nutritional, social uncertainties that are directly linked to spatial production. And the question would be, how do we as urban designers step in and take action, or like, let's say, propose ways of engaging with this. So we embarked in a process with local designers, local students and inhabitants. And I just want to show you 2 urban design schemes that were developed in the studio at ETH Zurich for the area of Ardileva, which is the area that you see here. I want to show the project Urban Seeds, which attempts to tackle the disappearance of agrarian land with a strategic urban design plan initiated by one single piece of architecture. So the idea is that you would have one building that shall ameliorate the production chain of valuable herbs collected and cultivated locally to allow for an increased revenue from yields and somehow impact the value of farmland. And it's the idea is that you have a production unit for planting, drying, processing, packaging, and selling these kind of high value herbs, which also allow to provide labor and work to locals and a continuous income for producing and a reliable supply for customer, all in one building. And what you see here somehow is the idea is to reestablish a kind of agricultural cycle from seeds to sales to engage and serve the community while advocating for the maintenance of productive agrarian land. And over time, the project will be then replicated in the surrounding areas, enhancing the value of this residual farmland and battle against its disappearance. The second project that I want to show is called Solidarity City, which embraces solidarity within the design process to produce a resilient, socially inclusive, and sustainable building block by pooling neighborhood resources. So this is actually building on something that exists already in these communities, very close ties between the residents of these neighborhoods, where people are already helping each other extensively because they are not really connected to any financial institutions. So the idea is to convert this social solidarity into a spatial reality with financial and spatial resources pooled, and construction that is then rationalized. So the idea is, instead of what you see on the left side, the current single unit, what I mentioned earlier, this kind of back-to-back typology built on a single plot with these blind facades, the project actually proposed the joint construction of 2 combined units on 2 plots. And this new typology offers a single staircase for 2 units. Instead of a second staircase, you basically have a courtyard, which you see on the center of the floor plans on the right side of the screen. And there's also new housing types with like common kitchens, which envision semi-communal ways of living, or that basically just replicate existing schemes, with the courtyard at the core of the building, which is something that exists in previous, or like in other existing typologies in older parts of the city. And the staircase offers somehow also levels of privacies as you go from ground floor to rooftop, with the rooftop only accessible to the women of the house. And the scheme suggests to push further this existing solidarity network that already exists by pushing it into improvements of current housing modes. And maybe one word about how the outputs are being, received. This is perhaps one of the important aspects of this idea of strategic practice and also maneuvering boundaries. While the work has been exhibited internationally, the kind of local exposure was an attempt to kind of contribute to changing perceptions attached to these self-built areas, which are often considered to be of poor value, and also able to sustain an engagement of our local partners in this neighborhood. So what you see here is an exhibition that was conducted in partnership with an institution that was there, that had a small art space. So what you see is basically what we call the mini construction fair, where we invited contractors and local construction actors to discuss and critique these floor plans, which they of course happily did. And the idea was that the same way that the existing floor plans that circulate among these construction actors could be supplemented by these. And you can see here one of the other schemes that was kind of handed over as a takeaway. And it's interesting because, for instance, I just like to mention that while we adored that project that you see here, because it's kind of something that when replicated could foster different types of connection between the buildings. You see that the circulation is basically going around the building. It was extremely critiqued by our partners there, who were like, well, people don't want to be exposed when they visit their neighbor up or down in your kind of open staircase. So basically, it was critique and ultimately. While the floor plans were really interesting, the kind of circulation schemes was like something that was not useful. So I mean, just a kind of a good example about what happens when you really dive into a closer discussion. So just to kind of also go on with the format, the research and the project were published in that book called Housing Cairo, which also calls for a reassessment of the way that planning engages with forces of urbanization, in this case, with the case of Cairo. And I will move then to the topic of governance. And again, here I borrow from research and design work that I did on Marseille when I was director of the Master of Advanced Studies in Urban Design at Zurich. So what you see here on the 5th of November 2018, two buildings, one of them which was public property, collapsed in the area of Noailles, which is a popular and quite modest but very central area in the center, so in the center of Marseille, with a building stock from the 18th century. The New York Times dedicated to the drama a long article calling Marseille the French Detroit. I'm not sure that's an apt, actually they changed the title afterwards. And they highlighting somehow bad governance and the lack of housing maintenance. And 8 people lost their lives. People were coming from Algeria, the Comoros, France, Italy, and Tunisia. And somehow the devastating toll of this urban decay reflects both the diversity of the district and the hardship of living in Marseille, a city marked for centuries by poverty and social struggle. It is a city that's settled between the sea and a mountainous region. So it's kind of a constricted territory, very much oriented towards the sea, the harbor, which you see like on the darker spots in the middle of that map. So it's a harbor city with a perceived proximity to the African continent, where it drew commodities from industrial economy via colonial activities. So it's owing a lot of its wealth to the kind of imperial past of France. As a trading port, constant flows of people and goods were shaping that physical, social, and economic geography. And of course, immigration waves of the past centuries are key to that. And as the harbor was expanding north of the city, its industrial enterprises, what you see here with like sugar, soap, and tile factories, and the kind of constricted landscape I mentioned blocking the expansion, the boom was also fueling migrant labor, Italians, Spaniards, and Corsicans, as well as forced migration from the colonies, Africa and Asia, a population that would then settle in the northern peripheral areas of the city, while the bourgeoisie would actually establish itself at the opposite side in the Thousand District. And from then on, you can say that the migratory growth was continuous, if at times transitory. What you see on this map, a kind of attempt to establish a kind of chronology of these waves. So after 1918, you had a wave of Russians that were fleeing the October Revolution, Armenians escaping genocide, Spaniards leaving Franco's dictatorship, and then post-World War II, employment migration from colonized North African countries, and around 1960, post-colonial migration with thousands of Pieds Noirs, which were French colons leaving independent Tunisia and Algeria, along with the Arquis, which was the population of Algerian natives who had fought along France and were forced to flee. And then the last and somehow ongoing wave from 1970, hailing from Comoros and more recently Syria, with the ongoing disaster. There is an urban counterpart to this migration history, as post-war, the whole of France was experiencing housing shortages, but no homes were constructed for these incoming laborers and their family, who clustered in simple provisional housing and transit camps, what you see on this map, and overcrowded self-built bidonville. And the northern neighborhoods, so you see on the north of the map, the harbor, but the northern neighborhoods, which is the location of the harbor, was already home to the industry, to the working class, to these precarious migrant workers and these families. Also saw the construction of 90% of the city social housing projects, which is now translated by what you see on the map, this zone sensible, which translate by difficult areas, which are official definitions by the state to point at areas where poverty and unemployment, as well as maintenance issues, are ripe. And as you see, the city center is also part of those. and especially the area of Noailles, sorry about that, here on the black dot, where the buildings that I mentioned earlier fell. So this is because Marseille's historical center has not been gentrified yet and still offers forms of urban inclusivity. So there is cheap housing, immediate job opportunities, and also affordable food and goods. So offering modest housing, Noailles, the area where the building collapsed, is home to humble populations and to a mixed population. And when the building collapsed, somehow that also damaged the area. However, this was an underlying condition because in 2015, there was a report that had listed 40,000 apartments across the city as being potentially dangerous, putting some 100,000 people at risk, an assessment that was followed by little official action. Now, the shortcomings of the municipality, which when the building fell, claimed that it was about rain rather than mismanagement, triggered a wave of demonstration calling for the mayor's removal and an end to unsafe housing. Now, the panicked reactions of the authorities was to pronounce many of these buildings uninhabitable. What you see here with this process of arrêté de péril, as it's called, which prompted the large-scale evacuation of the residents. The authorities would come to your building and they would hammer this thing or tape this thing on your wall, and you have 30 minutes to take your stuff and you will be relocated in a hotel. And this is something that took almost 2 years to be kind of treated with, like people living in hotel for over 2 years. And here what you see in black is the structures that fell, or some of the buildings that are considered to be unsafe and will be demolished. And these structures that fell are actually a very typical typology of the area, which are called 3-window, 3-fenêtres. And of course, what the tragic event of this dramatic collapse is indicating poor maintenance. And the buildings were then purchased by the municipality and demolished. And no real satisfying solution was provided because, as I mentioned, some of the inhabitants were staying in hotels until very recently, and at times small owners were forced to sell their flats because they're unable to pay for renovation costs and things like that. So local groups were actually calling for transparent, inclusive plans and decent rehousing, rather than what they were fearing what was coming, which potentially a kind of top-down profit-driven schemes with the city buying plots and building something else over it that would not be for the benefits of the local inhabitants. The project that I'm showing now is called Noailles Calling, is actually promoting the value of rehabilitation and maintenance by deploying an existing legal models, the Association Syndicale Livre, which is a kind of co-ownership organization that brings together co-ownership unions, which are the entity that manage the maintenance of the building, and kind of like merging these together. It's pooling the capital of these unions because it could then offer guarantees for loans to the banks. And the idea is that the ISL can buy and own property from a full block to a single apartment. And it can operate at all scales. It can renovate these buildings. It can also reconstruct properties, and it can also rent apartments to former owners and evicted residents, and potentially also revive ground floor and courtyards. So it's a legal model that brings the fact that you could actually come up with tools that renovate an existing stock without gentrifying it, which I think is the fate of so many urban spaces. And the project was then shown along with others in 2019 in Marseille under the titles 8 questions sur des sujets urbains, 8 questions on urban matters, in a very central area, very close to the place where the building fell, as we were working with our local partners and the local associations. We're trying to articulate questions, but we're also articulating some answers and visually communicating these in a kind of very simple wallpaper exhibition format, speaking and suggesting cooperative models, also asking whether a city is made in a day, or pointing at the fact that the most sustainable act is to maintain what exists. So the catalog is available in French. For those of you who want to use the QR code, it actually should work. It will take you to a French catalog that propose some of these solutions that we thought through. And I think what this exhibition was trying to do was to point at making this kind of discussion, urban and territorial design, a form of public knowledge. And the research and the projects were compiled in the book Migrant Marseille, Architectures of Social Segregation and Urban Inclusivity, which was basically documenting that process, also coming up with potential ideas of how to deal with these questions of inclusivity. Now, I mentioned the third topic, which is, I think, very much related, and all these topics, they kind of speak to each other, questions of ecology, materials, or resources. So here I want to talk a little bit about materials and the work that I do here, which is trying to bridge the distance between sites of extraction, production, and consumption, and also bridging design to materials in a kind of responsible way. And the approach here is grounded in the belief that there is no such thing as neutrality of design. I was mentioning earlier the impossibility of innocence. And somehow this kind of expansionist global enterprise of extraction that spans across all scales also integrates architecture in one of these scales. So there are several agendas in this work, perhaps pointing at the care and the maintenance of the earth as one, or the accountability of designers, and questioning the human stewardship of our resources, but also repositioning design discipline within a new ontology of material extraction, or challenging the production of and the reproduction of nature. It's part of a research that I'm actually conducting in parallel called Architecture of Exhaustion, Space and the Political Economy of Construction, Materials, Mineral Wealth, and Resource Extraction. So the idea was to identify construction material commodity chains and their relation to the built environment, to also establish a critical methodology around this political economy of construction materials. And what you see here is the trailer of the class. So there's an anxiogenic music over that, which you don't hear, but the kind of link between the line tracing and the kind of explosive consequence. Shows somehow that bridge that we're trying to establish. And I basically argue, and you have seen that this is also a part of the brief of this seminar, that every choices that we do as designer to solve architectural questions in a project has an effect not only when realized on construction site, but also on the side of extraction and of production. And to illustrate this position, here's a research drawing that that is called Scales of Extraction, which is an attempt to trace how the designer's choice of particular materiality will have repercussions elsewhere. It's just it's very much a working drawing, but it's trying to establish a kind of material thread from the building to the raw materials, and also point at these exploitative processes. So it's a kind of critical mapping or critical drawing to think analytically the built environment. So in this case, it's a single house, and it's an interpretation of an existing drawings that you might know, an exploded axonometric view called Parts, produced by the Californian office Morphosis in the early 80s. And it's a kind of precise inventory of each element used in the construction details of a house. And I kind of like linked it to the corresponding mineral. So it's perhaps non-exhaustive or naive and simplified as a listing of the materials that are used in a house, but it's also an attempt to mirror these extractive economies preoccupied with the origins of the material employed in the production of space in general. So, you can sum it up from the window frames of a house to the concrete pillars of a highway bridge or the wood flooring of the living room to the asphalt of the streets. The choices that are deployed in the materiality of the built environment have a global knock-on effect, and these processes use the reallocation and the relocation of the earth's resources, limestone, clay, iron ore, aluminum, diatomite, and so on, primary commodities that are correlated to labor, finance, energy, and ecology. And we know that the present modus operandi of global construction protocols and the most prevalent materials that are deployed currently in the production of space. So here you have a very rough list: concrete, wood, steel, brick, glass, petroleum-based materials, and one are kind of the main materials. And if one takes into account the hidden embodied carbon footprint related to the processing and the transportation of each of the materials into its final product, plus the labor necessary to make all of it happen, externalities, air quote, that very often we architects or the industry or engineers largely, let's say, ignore. So we talk about, pollution, carbon footprints, health of workers, consumers, and so on. And of course, those displaced by large-scale industrial development. And I argue that designers, and as designers, we should be fully aware of these links between space production and extractivism in order to challenge them. And again, we know we have to problematize the role of materials in architecture, in design, because we must face the constant increase of consumption of construction materials in the past decades, which you see here in orange, just the US raw materials consumed, and in orange, the material used for construction, which slightly peaks again after the 2008 crisis. In other countries, it's very similar. In Germany, the construction of buildings caused some 40% of CO2 emission, 52% of waste, and consumes 90% of non-renewable mineral materials. So when we were invited to contribute to the Seoul Biennale last year, we proposed an installation called Scales of Extraction, Politicizing Construction Materials. So we use 4 of the most banal construction materials used in the industry: wood, brick, steel, and concrete. These were sourced on the local market and assembled. And the form is generated in a kind of very basic way to ensure that the materials can be disassembled and reused by Habitat for Humanity Korea, who acted as a shadow client for this work. So they were like, you can't glue, you can only screw things, and you're not allowed to use cement, otherwise we cannot use your materials. And basically that guided the shape that you see here. And I think that the difficulties that we encountered in somehow securing this reuse of materials speaks or exposes the struggles of the industry, or let's say even like the cultural industry at large, to reinvent itself. And in a way, what we were trying to do was aiming to contribute to the rising call for change and pointing at the responsibilities that architecture and planning bear in the destructive processes at work. On this, you see that it's being used to project material. We actually used it to project 4 research works that were corresponding to the materials that are projected onto the structure. So uncovering how these ordinary materials are grounded in extractive processes, and how in turn politics and territoriality of resource extraction are materialized in the built environment. So I want to show you 2 small extracts, and they were produced in the frame of that seminar that I was mentioning earlier called Material World. So there will be no sound, but what we attempted to do was to show some of the link. We were looking at tracing a kind of embryonic political economy of these materials. I'm actually Yeah. So in a way, the work was trying to make visible and bring closer to hand the physical landscapes that are contained within this kind of concrete heavy built environment, and to critically interrogate the ecological and social impacts of its political economy. So I'm just let you watch for a few seconds. So it's looking at the Burj Khalifa as a case study and trying to understand what materials and where they're coming from. And of course, it also speaks of labor. Another work that you see here called Iron Tail was tracing the iron ore from the mine to the building. So with this work, we are trying to bridge what I was talking about earlier, that kind of distance between sites of extraction, production, and consumption, and also design to materials. You know, I think that what I was showing until now is linking somehow teaching, research, media, publication, drawings, and somehow perhaps establish a genealogy of my concluding part, which is now to come, and also aims at this illustration of what maneuvering boundaries can mean. So in March 2020, the world stopped and stood still. But not everything stopped. For instance, construction sites largely kept operating with some adjustments here and there. And I want to bring you this quote. The first lesson the coronavirus has taught us also is the most astounding. We have actually proven that it is possible in a few weeks to put an economic system on hold everywhere in the world. And at the same time, a system that we were told it was impossible to slow down and redirect. And this is a quote from a text published in March 2020 by French philosopher Bruno Latour, calling for a reset, arguing that if everything is stopped, everything can be questioned, banned, selected, sorted, interrupted for good. But as construction sites kept operating, the pause that was offered by the pandemic to question our societal model, as advocated by Latour, did not happen, and critical questions about the built environment remain unaddressed. Even worse, post-COVID, new policies are being put in place that stimulate an increased demand for mineral for built infrastructures, even called green infrastructure, all cloaked in a kind of progress narrative. And we know that every material, artifact, and we talk about an object or a building or a space, is actually grounded in its extractive origin. to which correspond this kind of physical contemporary condition. What you see here is sapphire extraction used in our computer lenses. So in a way, we ignore the past, the present, and the ongoing weaponization of extraction. I quote here Catherine Yusuf when she talks about extractive economies and the material geophysics of race, as well as white geology and its relation to power in her book, A Billion Black Anthropocene or None. Yusuf defines white geology as the way in which mineral nomenclatures used in traditional geology are devoid of references to racial and colonial history of material power. Yet capital accumulation and these brutal processes at work in this transfer of materials from the raw materials to the built environment have long been perceived as detached from design disciplines. And so while claiming an objective approach, education, practice, and technology in architecture disengage from political commitments and turns a blind eye to the very source of its materialization. Truth is the claimed neutrality of design and of design tools, and the underlying assumption that design is removed from politics. An inkling that prevails across many architecture departments and practices is simply no longer tenable. Stop Building, a global moratorium on new construction, is an initiative that emerged from this situation, calls to stop and think, remaining unheard. And its first steps take the form of roundtables from which I'm drawing today. So if the moratorium is first a provocation to think, it is also a very serious call to act upon the reality of these extractivist practices on which we rely, what Françoise Vergès calls extraction and exhaustion, not as a byproduct of capitalist accumulation, but in fact as capitalism's modus operandi, and the racial, social, and environmental damage that comes intrinsically with using resources means that building is a choice of destruction, and that a drastic change to construction protocols is necessary. Building moratoriums have been used globally to halt construction. It's a legal tool that exists. It's imposed by cities, local governments, and national courts. It can be short-term or indefinite, and there are precedents across the world, as you see here. Now, the limits of the degrowth narrative are both, known and understood. We also know that green capitalism has entirely voided the idea of sustainability, and also problematic CO2 reduction policies have become the stuff of riot. So how do you navigate these, and who is to say build or not build? And why and for whom is building ongoing? And this question of spatial and geographic inequalities that revolve around construction are, tangible issues. Yet it is difficult to probe the narrative of housing needs when home insecurity is such a real and an acute suffering for many. And it's also painful to interrogate the construction of infrastructures where not all countries are equally equipped. But precisely because not all countries are equally equipped in terms of housing and infrastructure, with perhaps overbuilding in one side and lack of housing in the other, one could assume that a new construction moratorium should be limited to extractive nations with a consolidated building stock, basically dividing nations along GDP lines. But when we look closely, and as shown here by researchers Omar Nagati and Beth Stryker, for instance, in Cairo, there are 12 million vacant units. So of course, this vacancy is grounded in locally specific conditions, outdated rent control laws, or lack of trust in banking institutions. People buy housing because they don't know where to put their money in a safe place. But these numbers complicate the equation and show the need and the urgency to assess our existing stock everywhere. Also, halting construction, even if temporarily, should suspend the race for discounted materials while questioning the narrative of progress and techno-positivism that is established around our societies. And we must question the growth imperative of the construction industry. Here, the example of Tokyo that is studied by our colleague Noboru Kawagishi, who was also part of the first roundtable. What you see here is office space construction in the Japanese megalopolis being exponential in pink on the right side of the graph. And you see in green that somehow the needs have lowered. and the home office practices and vacancy rates are on the rise again. So the moratorium would also be about seeking alternatives to real estate as the relentless economic motor, and also, help us inspect what the reevaluation of what not constructing could bring. So obviously, it's not about polluting privileged countries to ignore contextual complexities and call for blanket policy. As we were discussing the moratorium, South African architect Ilse Wolff showed that image of a self-initiated construction, a woman building a mat house, which is the traditional home of the Nama people in South Africa, as a way to interrogate the validity of the global call. So, of course, in some places, while housing is in high demand for marginalized communities and the existing stock beyond repair, we can also see that the state has fully disengaged from its mandate of providing affordable housing, while in other places, thousands of square meters of office space stand vacant. So politicians from all sides actually claim building more units is the solution, a storyline that I would like to question. And I think contextual complexities call for a deeper onlook on where and what is constructed and what should not be built. So while addressing moralizing issues that surround sustainability narrative, the posit is that while the modern project and its adjacent technocratic mindset must also be held accountable and critiqued for being partake in the current and ongoing disaster, the most urgent need is a structural change in the construction industry. Here I want to scratch the office. A large majority of practices are still patriarchal, hierarchical, exploitative structures based on single authorship, mostly unable to address the climate emergency because of their obsolete functioning. Under the building moratorium, the architecture practice would materialize as a continuous labor of care, and the definition of work of architecture expanded beyond the momentary. Design offices are to pivot toward resource stewardship, to deploy organizing abilities, to think about emancipated practice, not building less, building with what exists and caring for it. And what you see here is a kind of attempt to propose new jobs in relation to these proposals. The reconsideration of the existing regime of construction obliges to reflect, of course, on the redistribution of ownership and control over spatial claims. We basically argue that the most sustainable act is also to keep what is there, to leave matter unextracted, oil in the ground, laterite under the tropical forest of Guinea, coal under the German countryside, and so on. But this is not to say that nothing is to be done. As we stop and think what is really necessary, we must interrogate the imperative of growth that sell, and I quote Anna Tsing, a better life for all humanity, a mentality that continues to structure global asymmetries, materialized with the new construction of infrastructure and new cities, destructive imaginaries. Of course, you all know Place Léon Aucuc by Lacaton Vassal and the proposal to intensify maintenance protocol of the existing square instead of demolishing and building new, as a statement of how potent the absence of building, if attached to spatial care, can be, allowing for design to be entering beyond construction and articulating a critique of the archetypal assumption that architects must build new by practicing instead methods of prolonging. To stop destroying our resources, the disempowering current economic model of development needs to be put in question. If new construction stops even for a short while, not only the current build stock shall be revalued, buildings, infrastructure, materials, but also the values of its supporting care labor and those who carry it. An entirely new way of designing and perceiving the world emerges, one that demands a careful assessment of present and vacant inventory, a new set of values, strong anti-demolition and preservation policies, occupancy and ownership models, densification plans and maintenance strategies, upgrading tactiques, and alternative economic systems to be imagined, formulated, planned, implemented toward a new built and unbuilt environment. So if at first glance thought-provoking and inflammatory, the moratorium aims to initiate a conversation on common priorities, grounded in a global mandate, reacting to local context via architectural measures, design, and policies. So rather than seeking and to establish an universalist agenda, the moratorium shall operate as a radical thinking framework to work alternatives. And when we invited Nubian architect Mena Aga to the third roundtables on pivoting practices, and we started the conversation with Bruno Latour, she was like, who is to tell me not to build? And she articulated this by saying, not building to start constructing, as a way to address the needs of social urgency and the reconstruction of communities, the rehabilitation of the racialized gendered population that bears the brunt of ecological and social destruction, while being the very people engaged in reproductive and domestic labor. So imagining a world in where demolition and extraction is heresy, where soil is a precious matter, a world in which decentered, degendered, depatriarchalized, and decolonized reproductive work is shared by humans and non-humans alike, a world where repair labor is the most valuable of all works, a world where constructing is about precise management of resources, and architecture is the careful design of the reallocation of reclaimed materials and of pre-existing structures, a world in which technology is a caring friend and not an enemy, a world in which such an approach, with its roots in circular economy, anti-extractivism, and Black and ecofeminism, is no longer marginal, but is a mainstream modus operandi, the widespread, common, and banal realities to live in non-extractive society, a life worth living for. And I leave you with this graphic novel or extract of a comic that I produced together with Zozia Dierzewska, An Architecture Without Extraction, which was an attempt to illustrate, and as I conclude, also maneuvering boundaries of what is accepted as valuable architectural work. I think that's a good concluding word. So I thank you for giving me the space to discuss some of my work, and I hope there will be some questions.
Thank you so much. That was really impressive and fascinating presentation.
And fast. I have that tendency of speaking very fast, but I hope it was useful.
So now I'm hoping everyone will feel free to unmute themselves and ask any questions they have. Also feel free to type questions in the chat. And maybe we can kick it off with something I'm kind of curious about as a student here, and how the relationship I kind of saw with your approach to design with our class. And we're currently designing housing projects, and I guess I just wonder what advice you'd have to students specifically who are designing without consequence and have the possibility to ignore this innocence to a degree because of how hypothetical architecture and design schools are. And yeah, over the past couple of years, I've increasingly heard the phrase that the only sustainable design really is to just not build anything at all. But as architects, we're kind of told that that's not necessarily true. And your presentation has shown how you deal with this question. And so I wonder if you have advice on how to consider or be cautioned by the systemic repercussions of design and architecture um, for students in particular. I don't know how many of us students are on this chat, but I'm certainly interested in advice you would have.
Thanks. No, that's a very valid question. I mean, I also maybe I also articulate my work at times against my own education, which was very classic in the worst sense. So for instance, I studied in Marseille, so the university is under the shadow of modernist heroes, and I come from like critiquing that and being very having an acute sense that this is those are like models that we really have to interrogate, and I mentioned how this is also grounded in patriarchal and even colonial structures at time, and how critical we are of that. And I think that this criticism extends to the format of the studio, for instance, at times where we're, so I can give you an example. Today we were discussing what is going to be acceptable as an end product of a studio who's calling for a moratorium on construction. That's the studio that I'm now guiding or attempting to guide at the GSD. I don't have the answers, and I think that design is extremely useful to articulate new ways of seeing the world. So I don't know how that play out, in your studio where you say you're designing housing without consequences, but I think that the studio is, if it's well, if there is a space of freedom, it's very useful to envision other solutions if you're able to like free yourself from like limiting boundaries, I guess. So for instance, we're just talking with the students and we were like, can you do a project that's going to be about maintenance protocol? Is that architecture? And we were like, and I was like, I don't have the tools. I was not, no one told me that this was okay. I've been taught to, design stuff. So let's try. And we're trying. We'll be like, okay, let's see, your project might be, another project might be about decay. Can you design decay? Can you, like, another project is looking at tourism and the destructive nature of tourism, and we're saying this place doesn't need that, and the indigenous population that lives there doesn't want that, doesn't want any of that. So you're designing the transition towards decay, and this is also something that I was never taught to do. So I'm also kind of trying to articulate the design brief as something that is bringing us to places where we've not told to go. So the kind of also unsolicited aspect of the design work is very useful. So I'm not sure I'm answering fully your question, but I do believe that the design capacity is it matters, and I want to link that to the fact that so much of the damage is designed. And so much of, the way the American city is, structured is by design. You have engineers and architects who have designed highways splitting communities by race. This is design. So in a way, is it possible to use design to, undo some of that, or just like try to use our capacity as architects and designers to go beyond this kind of crisis of imagination that, this is the world we live in, and you know, there's no way out of that. So I really want to challenge this. Yeah, I don't know if this is answering. I see there's a question.
Yeah, that's great. There's a question from Sanjana, who is wondering who you consider the audience of your work and about its capacity to exist outside of the discipline of architecture.
Thanks, Sanjana, for your question. So the audience of I think that the two first works that I was showing, Cairo and Marseille, are very much trying to work with the people that are affected. So for instance, in Cairo, it's a very long-term relationship because I actually did my PhD on Egypt. I've, you know, really engaged with the place and have very good friends there, and I came back extensively over and over again. And one of the hidden agenda was to be able to harness the prestige of certain institutions, both Western and local, to challenge the perception that these self-built urbanization were bad. And this is something that we really engage in a multiple way. We also try to get things published by our local colleagues in the press and things like that. So there was a kind of hidden agenda, just to say that you were asking about whether that can operate outside the discipline of architecture. So that definitely did. I think that maybe not the book, but the shows, and then also the kind of more general engagement that definitely worked outside the discipline of architecture. And I think that was very successful. I can say almost the same with the Marseille work, especially the little show that was, you know, kind of really designed to be visited by people who just walk by. It was like an open space, people just like walk by and would like engage, and that kind of very vivid trauma of the building having fall down meant that a lot of people wanted to know, you know, how do we deal with that. So the ways that we engage were also very visual and not particularly technical. We also had a lot of works that were done in collaboration with our colleagues who are engaging in like walks in the city. So there were like artifacts and things like that, and a lot of people would engage, which we're not architects and we're just interested. So that worked well. To be honest, the moratorium is a bit of an experiment. So I don't know who's the audience. I'm just angry, and I'm just putting it out there. And I was like, some of it is because of my own incapacities to address some of the things that I feel we're not addressing as a discipline. So I guess that's very much an echo chamber. When it goes out, it's sometimes misunderstood and criticized. So you know, it's like people feel like it's a judgment. And it's easy from somebody who's sitting in a prestige institution to say you shouldn't build. And of course, this is not, I try to articulate that this is not about telling people what they should or should not build, but it's questioning certain dictates and pointing at the fact that a lot of what is being built doesn't go to the people who need it. So there is this underlying assumption that we're doing something wrong. And that is something that is going out of architecture in the industry, perhaps, so towards real estate as well, but doesn't fly very well when it goes into the realms of people who are engaged into like the housing production. So it was shredded on Twitter as kind of being a very elitist initiative, which I thought was, you know, kind of misunderstood, but on the same time, it was useful to see how people react to that. So I think I'm not sure about how much that one is going to be able to exist, as you were pointing, outside of the discipline of architecture. That's a good question in a way. How do we speak out of these? And I feel like the moratorium is because it's more it's a little it doesn't have like a context at the moment. We have, and I hope that the studio would actually allow that, because we have 8 sites. So how does that actually play out on the site would be something that maybe would answer some of your question. So yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, and then somebody asked about to elaborate on the scales of extraction after morphosis analysis. Should I walk you through? I can just tell you what I did. So the drawing, I know, and I have like a kind of old fascination with it, and I never looked at it as something that was actually problematic until a kind of epiphany where I was like, wait a minute, this drawing is actually a disaster in the making, as every single house that we do is in fact grounded in this kind of extractive processes. So basically what it does, it looks complicated, but it's actually pretty straightforward. That's why I said it's a research drawing. So it doesn't claim, you know, like exhaustion or anything like that. It's basically identifying each of the elements that make a house. So from, and this is a house, it's an American house, it's a Californian house. So it's cardboard and plywood, basically. It's pretty, you know, kind of very simple construction, but it has all these elements, the steel, the windows, you know, the pipes, it has everything. So basically what I did was I identified each of the elements, and then I traced them back to what are they made of. And each of these elements are made of, like, some of them are made of like 5 or 6 or 7 or like, you know, up to 20 different materials when they're like this kind of complex composite elements, like the isolation that's in the roof and things like that. And then from that element, tracing them back to what kind of raw material do they originate from, and then trying to have a kind of visual correspondence to that. So for instance, the wood is kind of like resulting in this kind of depletion, wood depletion, or, you know, the kind of oil rig as a kind of visual connection to the house. So that was what I was trying to do with these scales of extraction. So also hoping to actually continue the drawing to also show the kinds of exploitation mechanisms that are behind it as an additional layer. I had started a little collaboration with Imani Jacqueline Brown, who does amazing work with forensic architecture, and we were discussing about how that could be brought into play, and she was looking at labor and bodies as also something that would be an additional layer to these materialities. So yeah, I hope that makes it a little clearer. But it's a working drawing. It's just that for me, it encapsulates that distance between the choices that we make as designers and their kind of exploits or like destructive reality as almost like an image of that, or an attempt to do an image of that.
Yeah, if there aren't any more questions, then we can wrap up.
That's fantastic.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
This was really great.
40 people. That's so exciting.
Yeah, it's a good turnout. And I just want to let everybody know that before we sign off, I'd like to invite everyone to the student lecture series with Felipe Correa from Somatic Collaborative next week, March 10th, 6:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So thanks for coming, everyone, and thank you, Charlotte, for your wonderful lecture.
Thanks for having me, and thanks to everyone who came.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you.